Before the splintering of wood, before the lash tore the air, there was a silence that lay heavy and thick within the marble halls of the high priest's residence, as dense as the golden dust on ancient scrolls. This was the domain of Annas, a man too old for miracles, yet too powerful to relinquish his control over them. His true legacy was not built from the gleaming stones of the temple, the monument all of Jerusalem could see. No, his empire was an invisible tapestry, woven from whispered promises, owed favors, and silent threats that snaked through every market alley and shadowed courtyard in the holy city. He was the puppeteer, and Jerusalem was his stage. And then there was Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the man who wore the robe. Have you ever wondered about the true weight of that robe? It wasn't just the 12 precious stones representing the tribes of Israel, or the intricate gold thread that shimmered in the lamplight. No, its true weight was intangible. It was heavy with the crushing expectation of a dynasty. It was heavy with the burden of upholding an order that, in the dead of night, when the city was still, he himself had begun to doubt. Every morning, as his attendants draped it over his shoulders, Caiaphas did not just feel power. He felt the weight of a beautifully embroidered lie, a role he had to play to perfection, day after weary day. His palms, hidden in the sleeves of fine linen, were often damp with sweat. These were men who had reached the summit of their world. But at the summit, the air is thin, and the wind carries a single, terrifying fear. It is not the fear of an external enemy. The Roman legions in the Antonia fortress could be understood, negotiated with, managed. Their greatest fear was something far more ethereal, the fear of being forgotten, the terror of becoming irrelevant, the dread that one day the people would find something more sacred than the temple, a truth purer than their complex rituals, a truth that did not require their mediation. It was the ultimate horror for men whose entire identity was built on being the gatekeepers. And then it began, not as an army marching, but as an echo that drifted down from the dusty hills of Galilee, a region they had always held in mild contempt. This echo did not carry the clash of swords or the call for rebellion. It carried a simple question, a question that threatened to shatter their entire world to its foundations. It asked, "For what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Have you ever felt a truth so profound, so piercing, that it made you feel uneasy, even frightened? A rough, unvarnished truth that held up a mirror to the most hidden corners of your own heart. If you have, type the number 999 the comments below, because only then can you begin to comprehend the creeping terror that was slowly taking root in the hearts of the two most powerful men in Jerusalem. Their journey into the dark was only just beginning. The words of the carpenter from Nazareth were not a frontal assault. They were not the battering ram against the city gates. No, they were far more subtle. They were like a sweet poison, a slow-acting elixir. They did not kill instantly. They seeped into the souls of those who listened, transforming them from within. He spoke of the lilies of the field, which do not toil, yet are arrayed in more glory than King Solomon. He spoke of the birds of the air, which do not sow or reap, yet are fed by a heavenly Father. And every one of these seemingly simple parables was an invisible dagger aimed at the heart of a religious system built on sacrifice, offering, and the trade of grace. He was telling the people that God's love was free, and for an empire that profited from selling it, there could be no greater heresy. Annas and Caiaphas began to hear these words everywhere, like a contagion spreading on the wind. They heard them in the murmurs of the merchants in the marketplace. They heard them in the innocent questions of children. They sensed them in the hesitant gazes of the temple guards, men who were beginning to wonder if they were protecting a holy place or a bank. Worst of all, they heard them in the silence of their own wives, who had started gathering in secret to listen to the stories told by his followers. This echo was changing everything. It wasn't calling for a violent uprising. It was calling for a revolution of the heart, and that was infinitely more dangerous. Imagine, For a moment, Caiaphas alone in his chambers. Standing before a polished bronze mirror, he sees his own reflection in the majestic regalia of the high priest, an image of power and authority. But from the depths of his mind, he hears the echo of those words, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Was his heart pure, or had it been stained by political calculations, by worries over the profits from the money changers' tables, by a burning envy for this teacher who commanded such effortless devotion for the first time in his life? The sacred robe felt like a costume, its splendor only serving to highlight the emptiness within. For Annas, the fear was more refined, more bitter. He had spent a long and cunning life building an impenetrable wall between humanity and God, a wall to which only his family held the key to the only gate. Jesus, with his simple words, was teaching everyone from the fisherman to the tax collector how to speak directly to the Father in heaven. He was dismantling that wall, stone by stone. He was making Annas and his entire legacy obsolete. There is no greater humiliation for a man of power than to realize his life's work could be replaced by a single, heartfelt prayer. Have you ever felt someone's words, however gentle, shake the very foundations of what you believed? That is not a battle. That is an awakening. And sometimes, an awakening is as painful as being flayed alive. When Jesus entered the temple courtyard, a braided cord of ropes in his hand, it was not the calculated act of a political reformer. No, this was the raw, explosive fury of a betrayed love. It was the anguish of a son returning to find his father's house transformed into a den of thieves, where prayers were drowned out by the haggling of merchants and the bleating of sacrificial animals. But for Caiaphas, witnessing the scene from a high portico of the temple, it was a waking nightmare. He didn't just see coins scattering across the stone floor. He saw his intangible authority evaporating like morning mist. The crowds, the very people who had bowed their heads in reverence at his passing only moments before, now stood transfixed, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, all fixed on Jesus. They were no longer looking at him. In that moment, in the courtyard of his own domain, Caiaphas felt invisible. His magnificent robe, his azure tassels, all his carefully constructed majesty could not hide the sudden, gut-wrenching hollowness inside him. He felt naked before 1,000 eyes. That night, in the lamplit study of Annas, the air was as heavy as lead. Caiaphas confronted his father-in-law, not with the righteous anger of a challenged leader, but with a raw, unveiled fear that made his voice crack. "They no longer fear us," he whispered, and that admission was like a fissure appearing in the wall of their fortress. "Did you see their eyes, Father?" They looked at him as if they were looking at God himself. Annas, the old fox who had weathered countless political storms with unnerving calm, looked deep into his son-in-law's eyes, and for the first time in many years, he did not see a strong successor, a sharp tool for his ambitions. He saw a frightened child, and that fear, he knew, was more contagious than leprosy. It could paralyze an empire. They had to act. The decision was no longer born of cold calculations of profit and power. It came from a deeper, more primal place. They had to act to silence the echo that was now growing louder inside their own minds. The echo that whispered they were nothing but imposters. They had to prove, to the people, and more importantly, to themselves, that they were still in control of the narrative. The decision to eliminate Jesus was not born of cold logic. It was born from the searing pain of wounded pride and the absolute terror of being forsaken on their own stage. Do you think a leader's greatest fear is not the loss of power, but the loss of relevance, the terror of no longer being the center of the story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The confrontation was now inevitable. 30 pieces of silver. The number would echo forever down the corridors of history, a cold and sordid sum. But on that dark night, for Annas and Caiaphas, it was not merely the price of betrayal, it was the price they were willing to pay to purchase something far more precious: silence. not the silence of Jesus. They knew his words would live on, even if he were gone. No, they were trying to purchase silence in their own minds, to quell the relentless echo that now tormented them day and night. Imagine the secret meeting, held not in a grand hall, but in a damp side chamber where the shadows clung to the faces of the conspirators. Judas Iscariot stood there, his eyes darting nervously, his palms slick with sweat. Annas did not look at Judas with the contempt one has for a traitor. In his cold, pragmatic eyes, Judas was a necessary instrument, a sharp surgical knife. He looked at Judas the way a physician looks at a cancerous tumor that must be excised to save the body. He is unsettling the people, Annas said, his voice a low, emotionless monotone. The stability of Jerusalem, the peace of our nation, is at stake. This was how he rationalized it, transforming a cold-blooded murder into an act of statecraft. When the cold silver coins, taken from the temple treasury itself, were counted into Judas's hand, there was a moment of still. The only sound was the dry, dead clink of metal on metal. In that moment, perhaps both powerful men allowed themselves a flicker of relief. Finally, a concrete action, a tangible solution. A problem that could be measured and paid for in silver. They had successfully reduced a complex theological crisis to a simple transaction. What they failed to understand was that they were not purchasing a man, they were purchasing a curse. Each one of those silver coins would become a death knell, ringing in their souls for all eternity. They believed they were seizing control of destiny, writing the final chapter in the story of the troublesome carpenter. In reality, they were merely stepping into their assigned roles, becoming the lead actors in a divine tragedy whose script had been written by a hand far greater than their own. They wanted silence, but they were about to receive the opposite. With their actions, they were about to unleash a cry that would reverberate to the ends of time, a cry that would shake the foundations of the world. Sometimes, in a desperate attempt to extinguish a small flame, we accidentally throw a torch into a powder magazine, and that is precisely what Annas and Caiaphas had just done in the dead of that fateful night. The trial was a farce, a clumsy stage play rushed together in the dead of night, violating every rule and tradition they had sworn to uphold. Witnesses were brought in, their testimonies tangling and contradicting one another like the threads of a poorly woven tapestry. But the true stage that night was not the hastily assembled courtroom, lit by flickering torches. The true stage was deep within the eyes of High Priest Caiaphas, as he stared at Jesus, who stood before him with a terrifying calm, a regal stillness in the eye of a storm of lies. Caiaphas did not see a defendant. He saw a mirror, and in that living mirror, he saw everything he despised and feared about himself. He saw the fear of a man clinging to his position. He saw the weakness of a leader who had to resort to conspiracy instead of truth. He saw the deep, gnawing insecurity that he hid so carefully beneath the robes of power. The silence of Jesus was not the defiance of a rebel. It was the judging stillness of a perfect reflection. Every passing second of that silence was an invisible hammer blow, striking at the cracking facade of Caiaphas's pride. He wanted Jesus to scream, to argue, to protest, anything to break the horrifying quiet that was stripping his soul bare. In a final act of desperation, Caiaphas lunged to his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face flushed with a dark, furious red. And then he did the unthinkable. He reached up with both hands, seized the collar of his sacred high priestly robe, and tore it. A sharp, ripping sound cut through the sudden hush of the room. "Blasphemy!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with emotion. What further need do we have of witnesses? But it was not a cry of accusation. It was a cry for help. He did not tear his robe out of righteous, pious anger. He tore it because he could no longer bear the weight of the lie it represented. It was the instinctive act of a drowning man trying to shed the heavy clothes that were pulling him under. He was trying to smash the mirror that was showing him his true self. In that moment, everyone in the room, from the members of the Sanhedrin to the Roman guards, saw the truth. Not the truth about Jesus, but the truth about Caiaphas. They saw a broken man, his power revealed as a fragile shell over a panicked soul. Legally, he had won the trial, but he had lost, catastrophically, the war within his own spirit, and that was a battle no one could win for him. The sentence had been passed, not just on the Nazarene, but on the high priest of Israel himself. They thought the cross on the hill of Golgotha was the end, the final solution. Brutal but effective, a clear message sent to any who would dare challenge their authority. From a safe distance in the city, perhaps Annas and Caiaphas allowed themselves a moment of grim satisfaction. They had silenced the echo, they had restored order, but as Jesus breathed his last, they did not hear the silence they craved. Instead, they heard a scream. It was not the scream of a dying man, it was the scream of creation itself. The very earth beneath their feet began to groan in agony, shuddering violently as if trying to shake off the unbearable crime that had just stained its surface. The stone buildings of Jerusalem trembled, and the panicked cries of the people filled the streets. At the same time, the sky, which had been bright, suddenly wept. The sun hid its face, not behind a passing cloud, but behind a ghastly, funereal shroud of darkness that draped the land in an unnatural twilight. But the most terrifying sound, the most devastating omen, came from the very heart of their power. Inside the holy temple, the priests on duty heard a sound that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. A violent, tearing sound. The massive veil, as thick as a man's hand, woven of blue and purple and scarlet thread, the sacred barrier that separated mortal man from the Holy of Holies, was ripped in two, not from the bottom up, as a human hand might tear it. It was torn from the top to the bottom, as if an unseen, divine hand had reached down from the heavens and rent it asunder. This was no longer an omen. This was a declaration, a message delivered directly to the hearts of Annas and Caiaphas. The wall they had so carefully built and maintained for decades, the wall that gave them their power and their wealth, had been demolished. Their control was over. God was no longer confined to a room of their making. He was now loose in the world. Annas, standing in his marble-floored villa, felt the ground shake beneath him, but a far greater tremor was coursing through his own chest. It was the cold, sickening feeling of a master chess player who has just realized he has made a fatal, irreversible mistake. He had gambled everything, certain he held the winning hand. He had challenged the heavens, and the heavens had just answered with an indescribable fury. The game was over, and he had lost. After the chaotic days of the Passover, after the empty tomb was discovered, and the lie of the stolen body was purchased with silver, a new kind of virus began to spread through the opulent residence of the high priest. Silence. But this was not the peaceful silence they had paid such a terrible price for. This was a diseased silence. The silence of suspicion, the silence of unspoken accusations that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Annas and Caiaphas would sit at the same dinner table, on intricately carved chairs, before plates of expensive food. But between them now lay a chasm that could not be crossed. Caiaphas would glance at his father-in-law, and in the old man's calculating eyes, he no longer saw wisdom, but a manipulator who had pushed him down an irrevocable path. Annas would look at his son-in-law and see not a strong successor, but a weakness, a flaw in his perfect plan. A man who had acted on emotion when he tore his robe and complicated everything. They were no longer allies in a common cause. They were fellow inmates, chained together by a shared crime, in a glorious prison of their own making, walled with gold. Their wealth, once a source of immense pride, now became a silent mockery. Every golden goblet, every fine Persian rug, seemed to whisper to them of what they had lost forever: peace of mind. Caiaphas developed a strange obsession with water. His servants noticed him washing his hands constantly, compulsively, scrubbing his fingers raw as if trying to remove an invisible stain. It was an act he had heard that Pilate, the Roman governor, had performed The action brought no cleanliness. It only amplified the guilt. Meanwhile, Annas retreated into the past. He would spend hours alone in his library, muttering to himself, unrolling old scrolls of law and business accounts. He was searching for a loophole, a logical flaw, something to explain what had happened. He was trying to prove to himself that he had been right. But the answer was not in the ancient scrolls. It was in the unceasing echo of the words from Galilee, the echo that spoke of souls and kingdoms not of this world. They had everything the world could offer: power, wealth, status. But their souls were a barren wasteland. They had won a single battle, only to realize they had lost the great war for their own souls. The fall did not come like a sudden thunderstorm. It came like a slow, receding tide, gradually and unstoppably pulling everything with it. When the messenger from the new Roman governor of Syria, Lucius Vitellius, arrived in Jerusalem bearing a sealed scroll, Caiaphas already knew what was coming. He felt no anger, only a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion, as if he had not slept in years. The ceremony of his dismissal was not a public spectacle. The Romans were too shrewd to provoke further unrest. It took place in a private chamber, with only a few witnesses. But for Caiaphas, it was more humiliating than any public shaming. The act of removing the high priestly robe was not an administrative procedure. It was a stripping of the soul. As the heavy, ornate vestments were lifted from his shoulders, Caiaphas felt a terrifying lightness. It was like an actor being stripped of his costume and makeup on stage. His entire being, his very identity, was peeled away. In that moment, he was no longer Caiaphas the high priest. He was just Joseph, son of Caiaphas, a middle-aged man with no purpose, no power, and nothing left but his torturous memories. Annas witnessed it all in silence from a corner of the room. The fall of his son-in-law was his own fall. He was the architect, and Caiaphas had been the facade of the building. Now that facade was torn down, revealing the crumbling structure within. His legacy, the dynasty he had built with such cunning, patience, and ruthlessness, had evaporated with a stroke of a Roman pen. To make matters worse, his own sons, whom he had placed in positions of power, were not rallying to protect him. They were circling like vultures, beginning to fight over the scraps of the crumbling empire. They were behaving exactly as he had taught them, to put self-interest above all else. They had not been defeated by an external enemy. They were not overthrown by a popular revolt. They were defeated by the very emptiness they had created. Power, when it is not anchored to a truth and purpose greater than itself, will eventually turn inward and devour itself. They had tried to silence one man, and in the end, the only thing they had silenced was their own souls. The silence they had sought now enveloped them, a cold, smothering blanket of failure and meaninglessness. How does a man run from his own mind? How does one escape a prison that has no bars, a torturer who has no face? This was the final question, the only question left, that tormented their last days. For Annas, a man of logic and control, the collapse was internal, a quiet and festering decay. His escape was oblivion. He died quietly in his villa, surrounded by the scrolls he no longer read, and the ledgers of profit that were now meaningless. It is said his heart simply stopped, exhausted by the long years of fear, conspiracy, and finally, regret. He died, not with a scream, but with a whisper, buried under the weight of the very legacy he had fought so hard to build. A final, bitter irony for the great puppeteer, who was strangled in the end by his own strings. But for Caiaphas, the man of passion and pride, the tragedy was more protracted and violent. Stripped of everything, he became a wandering ghost in the city he once ruled. It is told that he eventually left Jerusalem, walking west toward the Great Sea, as if pulled by some invisible force. Imagine him, a broken man, standing on a cliff overlooking the vast, churning ocean. Perhaps he hoped the roar of the waves could drown out the ceaseless echo in his head. But no ocean is vast enough to swallow such a sin, his final escape. According to some traditions, was an act of ultimate desperation, a final, frantic attempt to find the silence he could never have in life. He chose an end where, at last, all voices, especially the one inside him, would be silenced by the eternal quiet of the deep. And what of Pilate, the man who tried to wash away his guilt in a basin of water, but the blood of an innocent man cannot be so easily cleansed? He was recalled to Rome, not to face execution, but a fate far worse for a proud Roman, to be forgotten in disgrace. He lived out his remaining days haunted by two things: his wife's terrifying dream, and the question he himself had posed to Jesus, the question that now became his personal tormentor. What is truth? He had sought political safety and, in the process, had lost his very self. A lesson history continues to repeat. Décades passent. The names of Annas and Caiaphas faded into the memory of a new generation in Jerusalem, becoming cautionary tales told by grandparents. But the final judgment, the judgment on an entire system, was yet to come. In the year 70 AD, the Roman legions, under the command of Titus, laid siege to the city. After a brutal, prolonged, and bloody campaign, they broke through the walls, bringing with them fire and destruction. The flames consumed everything. They devoured the markets, the alleyways, and the old villa of Annas, where the ashes of his ambitions might still have lingered. But the greatest fire, the most symbolic conflagration, raged at the temple. The magnificent structure, the pride of the nation, and the cash machine of the priestly dynasty, was burned to the ground. Its gold melted and ran between the stones, and the Roman soldiers, in their lust for treasure, tore the building apart, stone by stone, to retrieve it. The prophecy of the carpenter from Galilee was fulfilled with terrifying precision. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The legacy of Annas and Caiaphas, everything they had killed to protect their power, their wealth, the temple, their entire corrupt religious system was utterly obliterated in a sea of fire. All that remained were ashes and a warning, a lesson written in flame about the futility of building a kingdom in opposition to God. But there was one thing the fire could not touch. There was one thing no Roman legion could extinguish: the echo. The echo from Galilee was not silenced on Golgotha. It did not die in the sealed tomb. On the contrary, it was unleashed. It became a song, a hymn of hope, forgiveness, and love, sung by fishermen, slaves, widows, and even Roman soldiers. It spread from Jerusalem to Rome, from the Judean desert to the distant islands of Greece. The very men who had tried to kill it had, in their failure, become its unwilling, eternal witnesses to its indestructible power. The legacy of Annas and Caiaphas was not one of gold or power. Their legacy is a permanent warning that you can nail a body to a cross, but you cannot kill a truth. You can try to buy silence with 30 pieces of silver, but you will only receive an echo that lasts forever. And that echo, to this very day, continues to resonate in our world. It no longer rings as an accusation against men long dead. It rings as an invitation to a kingdom not built with stones or gold, but with faith and love. A kingdom where the broken-hearted are healed and the last in society are made first. If this story of ruin and redemption has stirred something within you, if it has touched a place deep in your soul, leave a single word in the comments below. Hope, because in the end, after all the fire, ash, and tears, that is the true legacy that rose. That is the echo that never fades. The story of Annas and Caiaphas, of their wealth and their ruin, ended in fire and ash. It was a story of power that consumed itself, of a silence bought with blood that led only to a deeper, more desolate silence of the soul. But the end of their story was not the end of the story, for every ending is also a beginning, and from the cold embers of their vanquished empire, a different kind of fire was about to be kindled. Let us turn our gaze from the crumbling villas and forgotten tombs to a single, locked room in the heart of that same city, Jerusalem. Inside, There is no marble, no gold. There is only dust motes dancing in the slivers of afternoon light, the smell of sweat and fear, and a group of men and women huddled together like a scattered flock. These are the followers of the Nazarene. The echo of his words is all they have left, but it is a faint whisper in a world that still shouts with the memory of Roman power and Sanhedrin authority. They are afraid. The city that killed their master could just as easily kill them. Peter is there, the rock, but his spirit is haunted by the memory of a rooster's crow and his own bitter tears of denial. John is there, the beloved, trying to hold their fragile hope together with words of comfort that even he struggles to believe. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, sits among them, her grief, a deep, silent ocean of strength that anchors them all. They are waiting, but for what? They do not fully know. They are clinging to a promise of a comforter, a power from on high. But in the oppressive silence of that upper room, the promise feels distant, like a half-remembered dream. They had seen the impossible, the empty tomb, the risen Lord. Yet now he was gone again, ascended into the clouds, leaving them alone with a command that seemed impossibly large, to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. How could they, a small band of frightened fishermen and common folk, ever hope to fulfill such a task? The world outside was a hostile sea, and they were a tiny, rudderless boat. Then it happened, not with an earthquake that shook the foundations, but with a sound from heaven. It was not the scream of creation in agony, it was the sound of its rebirth. A sound like the rushing of a violent, mighty wind that filled the entire house where they were sitting. It was a wind that did not topple walls or break doors, but blew straight through the walls of their fear, sweeping away the cobwebs of doubt and confusion. They looked at each other, eyes wide with terror and wonder, and then they saw it. Separating and coming to rest on each one of them were what looked like tongues of fire. But this was not the destructive fire of the Roman legions that would one day turn the temple to ash. This was a fire that did not consume, but consecrated. It was a fire that did not burn, but illuminated. In the heart of each disciple, that flame set ablaze, a new spirit. Fear was incinerated and replaced with a burning, unshakable courage. Confusion was melted away, leaving behind a diamond-hard clarity of purpose. Their grief was not erased, but transformed into a profound, empathetic power. They were no longer the scattered, frightened flock. They were an army, forged in divine fire. Have you ever felt a moment in your life where fear was instantly and utterly replaced by a purpose so great that it dwarfed all your previous anxieties? A moment where you were filled with a strength that you knew did not come from yourself. That is what happened in that room. And Peter, the man who had denied Jesus 3 times out of fear for his own life, stood up. He was no longer the trembling fisherman from the courtyard. His back was straight. His eyes blazed with the fire that now rested upon him. He walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the streets of Jerusalem, followed by the others. He faced the very city, the very people who had called for his master's crucifixion. The crowds, drawn by the sound, gathered around them, bewildered, and Peter opened his mouth to speak. The voice that came out was not the voice that had stammered a denial to a servant girl. It was a voice like a trumpet, clear and powerful, filled with an authority that stunned the crowd into silence. The echo had been given a voice of thunder. He spoke of the prophecies of King David, of the man they had handed over to be killed, whom God had raised from the dead. He did not speak with anger or condemnation, but with a piercing truth that cut to the heart of every person who listened. The result was immediate and miraculous. The very people who had been part of the mob were now cut to the heart, asking what they must do. That day, 3,000 souls were added to their number. The legacy of Annas and Caiaphas was a dynasty that crumbled into dust. The legacy of the man they had killed was a living, breathing, growing family, born not of bloodline or power, but of faith and a fire that would never be extinguished. The story did not end in the silence of a tomb. It began with the roar of a divine wind and the birth of a hope that would, indeed, reach the ends of the earth.